He had the face of death. Takahiro Shiraishi looked like a man who was lost in the emptiness of his own soul. A soul that was as vacant as his eyes. Eyes that held nothing. No anger, no spite, no contempt, and definitely no remorse. It's no wonder why during his trial, the families of his victims felt their anger and frustration was wasted on him. One of the victims' brothers would even say that his heart died. In his own words, Takahiro didn't sound at all like he regretted what he had done. Watching his sister's killer speak during the trial felt like being hurt with a sharp knife over and over again. Unfortunately, there was salt ahead for his open wounds. Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and today we are going to dive into the brutal, utterly diabolical, and incredibly chilling case of Takahiro Shiraishi. Takahiro Shiraishi had a normal childhood. He was born in the city of Zama, Japan on the 9th of October 1990, and he spent all of his life there with his parents and younger sister. According to those who knew him, when he was in elementary school, little Takahiro had average grades. He was quiet and pretty normal for any kid his age. He might not have been popular at school, but he had friends. And while there weren't many, no one hated him because he was kind, polite, and cheerful when he needed to be. His teachers also noted that, while average, Takahiro took his studies very seriously. He was attentive in class and never missed a day of school. These character traits would follow him into high school, where he became more social. Takahiro also got into athletics and baseball, and was quite decent at both. With time, his social circle widened because he was also a good listener. Takahiro's early years were so normal that many years later, when his terrible crimes were exposed, most of his schoolmates found it difficult to believe that he was the same person. However, if they were being completely honest with themselves, there were signs. And while those signs might have been negligible back then, they were there nonetheless. The general consensus for anyone who had encountered or interacted with Takahiro during his school years was that they found him creepy. Not creepy in a way that made people want to stay away from him. He just inspired a deep concern in them because most of the time he seemed lifeless. You see, from childhood, Takahiro had always had a laid-back, almost docile attitude toward life. When he wasn't listening to his friends talk, and sometimes even when he was, his face looked like a sad mask, like it was detached from his environment, present and at the same time absent. The only girlfriend he had after high school described him as an extremely gentle person. To her and many others, Takahiro couldn't hurt a fly. But in the same breath, she also spoke about bizarre instances. Another sign that more plainly foreshadowed his future crimes came in the form of choking games that Takahiro and a couple of friends at his high school played. On one occasion, things got so bad that Takahiro passed out. When this information was revealed to the public during later investigations, there were many who screamed that it should have been an early sign, a red flag of some sort. But there is context here, and I beg to differ on that context. How many dumb and borderline dangerous activities did you witness as a kid? And if you wanted to be honest, then answer this. How many more did you personally participate in? The truth is, there's no way anyone could have guessed that a choking game was an indication of Takahiro's future crimes. Because whatever was wrong with him wasn't immediately evident. It was buried in his deep psyche and would stay dormant for years. In retrospect, some believe no amount of therapy would have been able to fix Takahiro because he had thick walls around his broken psyche. Walls that he wasn't even aware existed. In his final year of high school, Takahiro's family fell apart. His parents separated and then divorced, and his mother relocated with his younger sister to another part of town, leaving him with his father. It's unclear if this is what led to Takahiro's decision to skip university, but he did. And from here on, his life would go on an irredeemable downward spiral to absolute perversion. After his graduation in 2009, Takahiro took on a couple of odd jobs, working in a food factory and a pachinko parlor before eventually settling for a supermarket job that kept him busy for 2 years. During this period, Takahiro made deliberate efforts to be close to his father. He continued living with him and helped out at his automotive design workshop. His father took notice of his son's effort and openly appreciated his presence and support. He even went as far as praising Takahiro whenever he was having conversations with his colleagues and neighbors. According to the latter, Takahiro and his father grew so close that they hung out at local bars where they drank and talked about life. It was during one of these conversations that Takahiro gave his father a glimpse into the state of his mind. He told his pops plainly that he couldn't find a reason to live. It's unclear how his father responded to this or if any actions were taken. But soon after this incident, in 2011, Takahiro quit the supermarket job and took a less respectable job as a scoutsman for a sex parlor in Kabukicho district, which is famously known as a red light district in Japan. A scoutsman is an individual, usually male, whose job requires him to convince conventionally attractive women to work in sex parlors. For every lady these men bring, they receive a commission. And if the scoutsman gets caught by the police, they could also face jail time because the job is illegal in Japan. However, this law is hardly ever enforced. So, why did Takahiro leave his former job for this borderline dangerous and shameful occupation? That's still something of an unsolved mystery on its own. It could be that the supermarket job wasn't paying well enough. Another reason could be that he had done something wrong that forced him to quit. Or it could be that Takahiro had begun to feel those perverse cravings in his psyche. The same cravings that would later lead to his gruesome crimes. He wanted to insert himself into an environment that would facilitate those desires. Much later, after he was caught, Takahiro would tell the police that he committed the crimes he did for money, sex, and nothing else. Now, Takahiro wasn't a particularly good scoutsman. In fact, it's safe to say that he was lousy at his job. Takahiro had the habit of approaching emotionally damaged, depressed, and vulnerable ladies who were ultimately bad for the business he was trying to convince them to join. Thankfully, most of them found him creepy enough to push him away. However, his colleagues in the scoutsman profession noticed and were not happy with his weird methods and client choices. If he continued this way, it would only be a matter of time before he would draw the attention of the police and land them all in trouble. So, one of the scoutsmen decided to take matters into their own hands. He took a picture of Takahiro and posted it online with the caption, "Watch out for this scout." If this was an attempt to discredit him, it had its intended consequences. Because when the police caught wind of it, they arrested Takahiro and sentenced him to 14 months in prison. But it was a suspended sentence, which means he wouldn't see any jail time except if he committed another crime. So Takahiro was forced to quit his scoutsman job. He was now an unemployed 27-year-old man with no money, too much time on his hands, and the danger of incarceration hanging like a dark cloud over his head. I mean, what could go wrong? In the days and months that followed, Takahiro filled his void with a curious obsession with social media. He invested all of his time on Twitter. But while most Twitter users engage in toxic, yet harmless banter on the platform, Takahiro had deliberate ill intent. You could argue that this is where it all began. One psychopath's boredom led to 9 unfortunate victims. On the Twitter app, Takahiro repurposed his scoutsman approach. His targets were still the same vulnerable, often depressed ladies with suicidal thoughts. But unlike real life where he easily came off as a creep, online, Takahiro could easily mask his depravity. And he did, successfully. He created 2 Twitter accounts for this. On the first account, he had the username @HangingPro. Takahiro projected himself as an individual that was proficient in helping people die, specifically through the means of hanging. On this account, Takahiro actively posted about suicide, assisted suicide, and hanging. especially hanging. It was sinister to say the least. In his Twitter bio, he wrote, "I want to spread the knowledge of hanging. I want to become a truly aggressive force. DM me if you're interested." Under the second account, Takahiro approached his victims differently. Here, he assumed the character of an individual struggling with depression, a victim seeking company for his misery. In one post under this account, Takahiro tweeted, "I want to forget everything." On another, "I want to disappear." On another, he wrote, "I really want to become the source of strength for everyone who is in pain. If you are at a dead end, please consult me." This is the second account that reveals just how detached Takahiro was from reality. The mere thought that he preyed on people who might or might not have wanted to take their lives is just plain evil. But Takahiro didn't care. All he was interested in was setting a trap. But traps are just that, traps. And as much as social media draws and holds the attention of unsuspecting people, most of us are still careful with how we interact with strangers online. So, Takahiro went one step forward and meticulously combed through the hashtags related to suicide. Just as he had specifically targeted vulnerable women during his Scoutsman days, Takahiro found and sent direct messages to users who had posted suicidal tweets with this message: "Let's die together." Takahiro was not only preying on these vulnerable Twitter users, he was also promising them death packs that he had no plans on following through on. In August 2017, Takahiro informed his father that he had found the love of his life and wanted to get a place of his own. Of course, there was no love in his life, and the reason he suddenly wanted his own place was for the freedom and privacy to move on to the next stage of his diabolical plans. But his father believed him and stepped in as a guarantor for a spacious loft that cost about $227 per month and was about 2.5 kilometers away from his home. On the 22nd of that same month, Takahiro moved in, and almost immediately, the killings began. Like many before them, Takahiro's new neighbors found him odd. They all lived in a 2-story, 12-unit apartment block. And one of the first things they noticed in the few weeks after he moved in was his bathroom ventilation fan. It was always on, always in use. They wondered, maybe he kept it on because of the terrible pungent smell that had taken over their floor and was emanating directly from his apartment. Those affected complained. Takahiro apologized, but nothing changed. Some neighbors also noticed that he frequented the neighborhood garbage collection point several times a day, every day, with black bags of trash in his hands. What was he constantly disposing of? At this point, you already know what the neighbors at the time did not. Takahiro's first victim was Mizuki Miura. She was 21 years old and the first person Takahiro met online who agreed to meet in person under the guise of a shared depression. Unfortunately for his perverse intentions, Mizuki wisely asked a male friend to accompany her. This male friend was 20-year-old Shogo Nishinaka from Yokosuka City. The date was August 13th, 2017, and the three met in a park, discussed, and had a drink. Now, any normal person with the intent to murder would back off because of the third party, her friend. But Takahiro wasn't a normal person. 6 days after their meeting, on the 19th of August, Takahiro borrowed 510,000 yen from Mizuki, the equivalent of $4,500 at that time. His reason for the loan was so that he could rent an apartment. This was probably a lie, considering he already had the apartment that his father had just got him. However, Takahiro was able to string her along to a real estate agency where, together, they checked out some apartments in Zama. Takahiro also promised to pay her back even though he had no intention to. And, unsurprisingly, this is where the problem began. On the 21st of August, Mizuki left a note for her family where she said she would disappear for a while. She also said she would be back, but she didn't give a time. When her parents saw this note, they panicked and called the police. And, after some investigation, they found the 21-year-old's phone in a woman's restroom at a Katasei beach in Fujisawa City, about 20 kilometers away from the apartment Takahiro had rented. Takahiro wasn't under investigation and the police weren't aware of his connection with her, but someone else was. And that someone was her friend, Shogo Nishinaka. Meanwhile, Mizuki had visited Takahiro that day with the plan of hanging out at his place for a couple of days. Some sources say she planned to move in with him. There's no way to prove this. However, Mizuki also had every intention of getting the money back that she lent to Takahiro. Takahiro told investigators much later that he didn't have the means to repay the money. He also knew that she would report him to the police if he didn't, and this would have triggered his suspended sentence. So for him, there was only one option on the table. Not long after she arrived at his home, he drugged her, assaulted her, and hung her. This was his first act of violence, but it stirred a hunger for more. Sex and money, his primary motivation. It was late August of 2017, and his next victim was just a few days away. Takahiro's second victim was Kuhara Ishihara. She was a great student, an active member of the student committee at her high school, a member of her school's drama club, and a big fan of both anime and video games. To the casual observer, Kuhara was a happy, active, and occupied teenager. But what most people didn't know that she was also secretly battling depression. Unfortunately, the person she eventually confided in was Takahiro. The two conversed for a while on Twitter, and Takahiro was able to convince her to come to his house. They planned to take her life with his permission. She was essentially going to his house for assisted suicide. One morning, she put on her school uniform and left her home. But she had no intention of going to school that day. In fact, she had already informed the school authorities that she would be absent. She was last seen at a train station at around 7 in the evening, headed for Takahiro's house. When Kuhara failed to return by evening, her mother began to fear that something was wrong. She called the school and they told her that they hadn't seen her. So her mother tried contacting her directly over the phone, but her calls wouldn't go through and her messages were left unread. It was early September, just 5 days after Takahiro's first murder. Earlier that day, Kuhara arrived at his home ready, but after a while she began to get cold feet. She no longer wanted to die. But Takahiro couldn't be less bothered. He drugged her, took sexual advantage of her, and hung her as promised. And when he was done, he went through her purse and stole her money, taking a few thousand yen from her, the equivalent of less than $100. The search for Takahiro's first victim, Mizuki Miura, was still on. The police were doing everything they could and chasing leads that led nowhere. The only person who had a clue about Mizuki's disappearance was her friend. For some reason, Shogo didn't take his hunch to the police. And we don't know how much Mizuki told him about her deal with Takahiro. We also don't know if she told him that she lent the stranger some money that she went to retrieve. But we do know that Shogo knew enough to call and confront Takahiro. He reached out to Takahiro demanding answers. Takahiro invited him to his house. And, unfortunately, Shogo honored his invitation. Upon his arrival, Takahiro knocked him out and strangled him to death. In what was about to become a routine, Takahiro searched his wallet and stole the equivalent of less than $1. The reason for this killing was slightly different. In Takahiro's brain, he was tying up loose ends. Because of his 9 victims, Shogo was the only man. Takahiro's fourth victim was Hinekon Sarashina. She was 19. Hinekon appears to be the first victim that Takahiro promised a death pact with. He took advantage of Hinekon's depression and upon her arrival, assaulted her before strangling her with a rope. And when she was dead, he stole a couple $100 from her wallet. By the 23rd of September, Takahiro was on to his next victim, 26-year-old Hitomi Fujima from Saitama Prefecture. She had canceled a scheduled meeting with another male friend earlier that day, after telling the same friend that she was going to see someone she got acquainted with on Twitter. When she didn't return home later that night, her family rightfully panicked and called the police. But it was too late. That afternoon, Takahiro had assaulted her, strangled her to death, and robbed her wallet of the little change that was there. But, unfortunately, Takahiro wasn't slowing down. A few days later, he was on to his next victim. The family of 17-year-old Natsumi Kubo was crippled with fear when her school called in to report that the teenager had failed to attend school that day. To make matters worse, when the police tried to track her phone's GPS, it got cut off in what they would later learn was Takahiro's neighborhood. Mind you, no one suspected Takahiro at the time, and as far as this case and all the cases before it was concerned, he didn't even exist. At this point, you know the MO. You probably already know what happened. The moment 17-year-old Natsumi Kubo arrived at Takahiro's house, she was drugged, assaulted, and hung to death. Then, the vile pervert went through her purse and took the little money she had. She was his sixth victim. On the 27th of September, another 17-year-old girl failed to show up at school. Her name was Akari Suda, and in the days leading up to her disappearance, her classmates reported that she withdrew from their class group chat. And when the police tried to trace the phone, they found once again that it stopped emitting signals around the same area as Natsumi Kubo, the 17-year-old who went missing just days before. Do I need to get into the details of what happened? With the utmost respect to the victim and their family, it was the same MO, same act, and as usual, she got robbed, posthumously by Takahiro. At this point, and as is often with the case with most serial killers, Takahiro must have begun to feel a bit cocky, perhaps even untouchable. He had killed 7 people at this point, 6 of whom were girls, and yet the police weren't even remotely close to figuring him out. Thankfully, this cockiness led to errors on his part, errors that would eventually lead to his capture. Takahiro's next victim was 25-year-old Kazumi Maruyama. She worked at a convenience store, and while it is unclear what exchanges she had with Takahiro that led him to draw her into his trap, it's safe to say that it was related to suppressed feelings of depression and suicide that she harbored. Takahiro took her life, and like the others before her, he robbed her posthumously. However, like I said before, Takahiro had gotten sloppy. The killings had become routine for him, and he had begun to leave trails of damning messages on his Twitter feed and in the DMs that all led to his fake accounts. To be more candid, it's not like he wasn't sloppy from the very beginning, but that's besides the point. What mattered at the moment was that his time was up. Takahiro's next victim was about to be his final victim. Aiko Tamara was a 23-year-old resident of Hachioji City when she disappeared on the evening of the 21st of October. A lot had happened in Aiko's life that made her susceptible to Takahiro's snare. Her mother had recently passed away, and the loss had plunged her into a depression so deep that she had to move into a group home where residents received assistance from psychiatric professionals and social workers. However, her movement wasn't restricted and her social media use wasn't regulated. So, her time at the home was spent surfing Twitter, looking for like-minded people she could discuss her feelings with freely and anonymously. Unfortunately, Takahiro found his way into that category of people. And, after a few dozen messages, Takahiro drove her from despair into a bleak realization that she had to end her life to find peace. They agreed to meet, and she made the trip from her side of the town. However, before she left, she told her supervisors and older brother that she was going to visit an acquaintance. She didn't give them any other details, but they were expecting her to return that night. She never returned. When Aiko arrived at Takahiro's house, she began to get cold feet. Of course, she didn't want to kill herself. It was grief that had taken her into those depths of despair, not a lack of purpose. All she needed was time to heal. Takahiro did not care. He had his plan. And the moment Aiko turned her back on him, he knocked her down. She fought back, but he overpowered her, strangled her, and hung her from the loft of his apartment, doing to her exactly what he had done to the 8 victims before her. But this time there were clues. One of the first was uncovered by the police. They were able to trace her location with the help of CCTV cameras and the GPS to the Hachioji Station and the Odakyu Odawaras Line, Sobudai Station. Police also found that she was not alone. Walking with her was a man that bore the resemblance of Takahiro Shiraishi. However, this didn't lead to Takahiro's arrest. His arrest was a little more dramatic, a little more personal. Unknown to Takahiro, Aiko had informed her older brother of him and their meeting. And when his younger sister failed to return from that meeting, he knew exactly where to look. First of all, he hacked into his sister's Twitter account where, to his horror, he found the messages that she had been sharing with Takahiro. He noticed that there was an attempt to delete the messages, but there was enough for him to establish that this was the same man that his sister had gone to meet. So, Aiko's older brother contacted a female friend of his. They set up a fake account on Twitter, messaged Takahiro's account, and gained his trust, which was surprisingly easy. And Takahiro eventually agreed to meet them with a message that read, "Let's die together." Aiko's older brother then contacted the police and informed them of their plan. Thankfully, the police cooperated, and they went along with Aiko's brother to the designated meeting place, which just happened to be Takahiro's home. The moment they knocked, from the moment Takahiro opened his door, he knew the game was up. They asked him where Aiko was, and he immediately told them that she was in the freezer. What the police found inside his apartment shook them deeply. Dismembered body parts were stuffed into 3 coolers in the apartment. Heads, arms, and legs. There were also 5 large toolboxes, each containing its own collection of rotting body parts. Most of the body parts had huge chunks of flesh removed in what appeared to be a half-assed attempt to skin the flesh from the bones. Some of these parts were also found in cat litter, which, once again, was another half-assed attempt to mask the stench that came from the rotting corpses of his victims. It didn't help. Eventually, 240 different human bones were found in the apartment. There was no way to determine the identity except through DNA testing. The police did find the dismembered bodies, or what was left of Aiko's body, as well as her ID and what appeared to be her handbag. Takahiro's confession was quick and easy. He didn't hesitate to tell the police the story of who he killed and how he killed them. The MO was, as stated, he stalked out his victims on Twitter and brought them back to his apartment under the guise of assisting them or joining them in suicide. He then told the police that all of his victims changed their minds about taking their lives at the last minute. None of them wanted to die, but that didn't affect his intent to kill them. He killed them regardless. So, why? Why did he kill them? Sex and money, he said. They were merely objects of his desire. During parts of the questioning that followed his arrest, Takahiro would chuckle as he joked about how hard it was to dismember the bodies, and how surprisingly difficult it was to dispose of them after. He was disturbingly nonchalant about what he had done. He told them that the dismembering happened in his bedroom, after which he would dispose of the parts in a garbage collector that was shared with his neighbors. According to him, his first killing was the most difficult to sort through. It took him 3 days to cut apart the body. However, he admitted that with time, he became more adept, skillful, and efficient with cutting and disposal to the point where he could get rid of a body within a day. Now, this is where Takahiro began to show a more bizarre side to his personality. He was more shocked about his arrest than anything else. He even told the press that the thought kept him awake at night, and he wished he had done more to hide and destroy all of the evidence that led to his discovery. Because believe it or not, while he busied himself with the bodies of his victims, he left their personal effects, their phones, bags, and wallets around his house. It skipped his mind. Takahiro was no Ted Bundy. He was not the type of serial killer who kept trophies. He was a beast without a leash. Takahiro moved as his vile spirit led him. When Takahiro's case was brought to light by the media, it grabbed the court of public opinion in a chokehold. The entire country was scandalized by the gory details and the ethical questions it raised, especially when it came to the responsibility that the social media company Twitter had to bear. Jack Dorsey, CEO of the company at the time, offered his condolences to the families of the victims, but in the same breath, considered the idea of auto-deleting suicidal tweets to be unrealistic. Meanwhile, efforts were made to hide the identity of the victims in accordance with Japanese law. But if you know anything about Japanese true crime cases, then you know it was an exercise in futility. Mainstream media and tabloids colluded to unearth not only the details of the case, but the identities of the 8 females and 1 male that were viciously killed. They even provided updates on the case in real time. It was sad to witness, and it placed more burden on the grieving families of the departed, especially because they had to deal with the rumors that ensued. Imagine losing a loved one in such a tragic manner, and then having to deal with sensationalist headlines about your loved one being eaten by the maniac who killed them. Of course, it wasn't true, but that was the rumor in town, and you know how much people love rumors. Takahiro's trial was frustratingly long for everyone involved, despite the fact that the man had already confessed to everything he had done, and even helped the investigation that brought him to trial. At first, the prosecutors wanted to be sure that he was mentally competent enough to be held liable for his crimes, because there was nothing about his behavior that seemed normal. Fortunately for everyone, he was deemed competent, and his case proceeded to court. During his trial, the media tried to get an in-person interview with him. However, Takahiro demanded payment. And since no one wanted to be the company that paid the maniac money, they declined. However, there was one media company that not only refused to pay him, but also called his bluff and came to visit him regardless. Funnily enough, Takahiro not only granted them an audience, but he crowed like a rooster at dawn. They even got him to shed more light on his damaged psyche, his thought process, and his sense of morality. Takahiro told them that he just didn't care. He loved his family and wouldn't do anything to hurt them. He also said that he couldn't hurt people that he had come to know and love. But that was where he drew the line. Everyone else was fair game. It was a dichotomy for him. He couldn't harm the people he knew, but for people he didn't know, he could skin their bones white without losing any sleep. There was zero remorse. During this interview, Takahiro spoke about the crimes with the same enthusiasm that one would speak about an eventful bachelor's party in the Bahamas. He laughed, he made wild gestures, and he even hinted at the prospect of writing a book or long letters if the price was right. Meanwhile, in the trial, Takahiro's attorney tried to, once again, raise questions as to whether he was actually competent enough to be held criminally responsible. They raised a second wave of psychiatric exams, arguing that his mental capacity was significantly diminished at the time of the crime. This defense was thrown out by the presiding judge, and Takahiro was ruled mentally fit. Later, Takahiro's defense claimed that Takahiro's murder was, in fact, a form of assisted suicide, and that his victims fully consented. They even suggested that when his victims struggled against the strangling, it was merely a reflex, and that the victims hadn't necessarily changed their mind. But Takahiro had already negated his defense in his testimony to the police. And when he was questioned again by the prosecution, he reiterated that none of his victims had consented to being killed. Eventually, the prosecutors demanded the death penalty, and Takahiro was unbothered. He reportedly said, "I humbly admit my guilt and will accept the punishment." He even apologized. I don't know if I would call it an apology, but this is what he said to the families of his victims in court. "I am very sorry for taking their lives so easily." After this apology, he pled guilty on all counts and stated that he would not appeal the court's final decision. In December 2020, Takahiro Shiraishi was sentenced to death. In the aftermath of Takahiro's sentencing, the questions raised about the dangers of social media, especially as regards to its use amongst people with mental illness, still remained. Everyone wanted to know how vulnerable members of society could be protected from predators like Takahiro. The Japanese government and several social networking services vowed to push for more support for young people with mental illnesses. Japan's Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, yeah, it's just one ministry, made the decision to fund online support counseling in some areas across Japan, utilizing popular chat apps such as Line. The government also decided to improve education for elementary school students, revolving around social media, its use, and interpersonal relationships in Japan. These policies have since been adopted in other countries. With time, Twitter began linking users who searched for death-related hashtags to non-profit organizations specializing in suicide prevention. Today, Takahiro Shiraishi is still on death row. Japan has a law that disallows inmates or the general public from knowing the day they will die. It may take a while, but Takahiro is bound to face justice. In the meantime, one can only hope that he is the last of his kind. But we live in a crazy world with a lot of volatile characters. The best we can do for ourselves and the ones we love, especially the ones we know might need help, is to offer our kindness first. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Minds. That was the case of Takahiro Shiraishi, and why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.